Hello, everyone. And depending where you are sitting right now, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Sean Ellison, and I'm a senior economist with the RICS based in Sydney, Australia. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us for this World Built Environment Forum webinar, where we discuss the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic on Asia Pacific, with a focus on real estate markets. For those of you who have not already joined the WBEF online forum, I would encourage you to do so at rics.org/WBEF, as we will be hosting a series of webinars and other events in the coming months, and a recording of this session will also be available later this week on the site. This webinar is made possible thanks to the support of our premier partner, Colliers International, as well as our executive partners, Shanghai Oriental Investment Supervision and Glodin. I'll also add that this is an interactive webinar, and I would encourage you all to submit questions for the panelists. There will be a poll at the end of the webinar, which I would also encourage you to complete, as it will help us inform future webinars. So I think that we can all agree that these are exceptional times, and this type of a shock to the global economy is something that none of us have ever experienced before. That being said, we are extremely fortunate today to be joined by a panel of experts to share their insights into how this pandemic has affected economies and real estate markets in Asia Pacific, and perhaps more importantly, how they expect this to play out and what the lasting effects are likely to be. I think that one of the things that can keep us sane during this period of heightened stress and uncertainty is remembering that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Our panelists have decades of experience in real estate markets and sit across Asia in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Singapore. So today I am very pleased to be joined by Andrew Haskins, who is a director, Colliers Executive Director of Research for Asia, Sam Harvey-Jones, who is Colliers Managing Director of Occupier Services for Asia, Tammy Tang, who is Colliers Managing Director for China, and Terence Tang, Colliers Managing Director of Capital Markets for Asia. So thank you all very much for joining us today to share your insights. All right, so without further ado, let's get into it. So to start, I think it's almost unanimously agreed that the shock from this COVID-19 outbreak will be the biggest that the global economy has seen since the GFC and perhaps even the Second World War. Can you share what some of the early indicators tell us about how bad it is likely to get, and how quickly APAC economies and real estate sectors can be expected to recover? Andrew, if we could perhaps start with you, please.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, everybody on this call. To answer Sean's question, yes, this will be a sharp shock, at least as sharp as the global financial crisis. Originally, which is to say just 4 to 6 weeks ago now, when Colliers was assessing the effects of COVID-19, we based our analysis on the most natural comparison there was, which was the comparison with SARS in 2003. And on that basis, I think perfectly reasonably assumed that there would be a rebound in activity in Asia Pacific real estate markets from perhaps the early part of the second half of the year. Now, of course, since then, COVID-19 has spread globally and has started to affect Europe and North America, in some cases very seriously. And therefore, it seems reasonable to expect a 3 to 6 month delay in the pickup that we had expected. But that pickup, we still think, will happen eventually. And perhaps the key reason for that is China. China, during the SARS outbreak in 2003, on a purchasing power parity basis, was about 9% of the global economy. During the global financial crisis, 2008 to 2009, China was about 12% of the global economy on a purchasing power parity basis. Now, during COVID-19, it's 19%. And it's actually the largest economy in the world on a PPP basis, ahead of the US. Now, China, it's perfectly reasonable to expect China to pull up the region and perhaps even the world, just as it did after the GFC. Certainly, some things can go wrong. Certainly, although there are problems still even in China, although it is going back to work, cities are reopening, companies are starting to function again. The official manufacturing purchasing managers index for March was above expectations. So there are positive signs. Those should continue. Maybe we're only talking about 1% GDP growth this year, but we could be talking about a bounce back, perhaps even to 8%. In 2021. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. At that point, I would probably add, so far, COVID-19 has had an impact on real estate markets, but perhaps not dramatic. Rents were affected in some markets naturally, less so in others. For example, Singapore and Tokyo. My colleague Sam Harvey-Jones could talk about that.
Yep. Well, thanks, Andrew. I mean, what I'd actually like to just sort of really touch on here in this question is more around the sectors, Andrew. You know, I'm looking at a bit of research that we've carried out with our global clients over the last week around the sectors and to what responses we've seen from an occupier perspective. And I think some of these findings are actually pretty interesting. So, yeah, we asked 3 questions of our clients: status of their transactions on a global basis, but obviously we looked at it mainly from an APAC perspective. But if we looked at the consumer goods sector, 76% said there was no current change to the status of their transactions. Within the professional financial services, 59% of our clients said there was no change there. Within the technology, media and telecom sector, 56% said there was no change there. And from a manufacturing and distribution, 50% of our clients said there was no change. So fundamentally, I think what that says is it's probably too early to tell really what the medium and the long-term impact is going to be, but at the moment, a lot of our clients are still continuing to push through. The second question that we asked them was, what was their demand for space? And we looked at this in terms of, was it the same, was it going down, or were they to be determined? And across the board, about 80% of the responses said there was a combination of no change and to be determined. Again, that to me suggests that we're still in the early stages and time will tell. And then the third question that we asked was really what were the first initiatives that our occupiers were looking at? Yeah, what were their primary focus? And we can touch on this a bit later in more detail, but up to 50% of the occupiers were saying that really the most important thing for them at this time was some kind of rental relief, something that helped them protect their profitability in 2020. At the same time, of course, making sure that they were sustainable in terms of how their businesses continue to grow into 2021. I guess from a APAC perspective, just to close that out, we have seen some delay. What we haven't seen is any real, I guess, any sort of those transactions closing or not happening. I think in the short term, over the last 2 weeks, as the US and Europe entered probably more of a critical stage around COVID-19, a lot of our clients, a lot of our multinational clients in particular, who were transacting in this part of the world, a lot of the decision makers based overseas reorientated their concerns to more of their HQ in their home markets, where obviously the human element and the BCP piece to make sure that everyone was surviving was much more important than worrying about activity in another part of the world. So I think it's more about delay, people welfare. There's definitely some uncertainty around capex and money at this time, but I think for now it seems to be status quo, and we do seem to see quite a lot of activity ongoing at this current time.
Hi, Sean. This is Terence. Just to add from the capital markets and investment perspective, I think most of the investors in the region were definitely caught unprepared, and how global this pandemic is and how fast it is. So we have not seen a lot of investment activities over the last quarter, and we are expecting it to stay the same in the next quarter. The earliest investment activities we think will come back to the market will be in the second half, and it will definitely be led by China and probably Hong Kong. In terms of investment activities returning to normal level, for most Asian markets, it will probably take a year or so. At the end of the day, investors is still trying to understand the economic impact and the financial impact that this health crisis has created.
Thank you,
That's
Terence. Before moving on, I might flick back to Sam for a second, and just with this sort of wait and see and the sort of steadiness that we're seeing in real estate markets right now, how much of that can be attributed to real estate being maybe a longer term play than other asset classes? And then, you know, as well as sort of the heightened nature of uncertainty, where unlike other crises, you know, we don't really know how long this virus will be around for.
Yeah, but I think, Sean, that's the crux of the challenge at the moment. You know, I think on an occupier perspective, yeah, a number of our customers still have to make decisions. You know, they still have expiries and there's still activity within their portfolio. So, you know, where necessary, they are still transacting. But where perhaps there was a focus more on a relocation, a consolidation, or some sort of optimization around the portfolio, and these have been a little bit slower. But again, what I'm hearing is a lot of this is more a function of the rest of the world also being in a slowdown, rather than the function of companies' desire to keep on growing and expanding in Asia. Generally speaking, particularly from the financial services, the professional services, and the tech sector, our clients are still saying is that their intention is short to medium term to continue growing. And I'm sure if Tammy, wanted to comment, but in China, we're seeing a huge growth opportunity from domestic-based clients, of which I think we're going to see more and more focus from an occupier perspective for the rest of this year and probably the first half of next year, because they're really seeing an opportunity to take advantage of market conditions, and there's a huge amount of domestic consumption going on in places like China, and I have no doubt once India comes out of its lockdown, we'll see the same thing there as well. A lot of it will be driven by internal domestic business.
Correct. If I can concur with that comment, from a China perspective, we're probably the first country that came out of the situation, and we're already seeing a huge rebound of confidence and spending power. Restaurants are packed in major cities. Shanghai basically back to normal, followed by Beijing itself on its own, although Beijing is shut down from outside, but Beijing, all the spending powers are back. Specific sectors are particularly strong: video streaming, high tech, gaming, technology, healthcare, pharma. But I guess coming back to an occupier perspective, a lot of the occupier are rethinking the strategy, and many are hoping that they can be more flexible than where they are right now. One side of the flexibility is because they need more growth. Adopting maybe co-work space or temporary space, they can accommodate to growth, and people working from home more, adopting more technology, then they're more flexible to adapt to any changes.
Thank you, Tammy. One thing of interest that you mentioned there was at the beginning where you said that restaurants were packed in a couple of cities. Does it mean that some of these cities in China have already dropped all of their restrictions that they had in place around things like social distancing, as we know it elsewhere?
Yes, so Shanghai, for example, has already relieved all the distancing. I think some of the second-tier cities have been to Xi'an. Most of these are relieved. Chengdu as well. And Ningbo as well. So I've been to some cities during the last month. I can't go to every places, but a lot of them are seeing a rapid pace of recovery. I think people, after being locked down now in China for more than 8 weeks, they're desperate to come out and spend money.
Well, thank you, Tammy. And that is good news that you're actually able to travel. It's even domestically, something that, I mean, we in Australia are no longer able to do at the moment. And I think that's probably true for a lot of places in the world that are a little bit later in the cycle than China is currently. I might move on a little bit now and shift over to Andrew to talk a little bit more about the Chinese policy responses, and specifically whether the policy response from China and other nations in Asia that were sort of hit a little bit earlier than some of these Western countries, have they really set a bit of a framework for other countries to follow?
Sean, thank you. To respond to that question, I think you really have to focus on China. It went into the problem first, and it's coming out of the crisis fastest. Really, I think and Tammy, I'm sure will add to this, but the reaction in China took the form of large liquidity injection, really right back in early February, and then micro measures, tax concessions, special lending arrangements, requests for or encouragement for state-owned enterprise landlords to give rent concessions to small and medium companies. Now, to some extent, that is being followed in the later in the rest of Asia. I mean, major stimulus packages are being announced around the region. Singapore has had 3 so far. I think, except in the case of China, it's probably too early to say whether these have succeeded or not. But actually, to me, the most interesting outcome really isn't an economic one. The most interesting policy has been the lockdowns themselves. Now, of course, being eased in China, a harsh measure, but from a real estate perspective, fascinating, because it unleashed the biggest work from home experiment that has ever been seen. That started in China. It has been copied in Hong Kong, Singapore. It's now being repeated in India. Sam, I know, will talk more about this in due course. But this produces lots of implications for how companies should behave, how corporate occupiers should behave. It has implications for things like decentralization. I'm sure Sam and I'm sure Terence will pick up on some of these points in the course of the discussion.
Right.
Please, Tammy.
Right. So from a China perspective, obviously, I'm here to felt it for about 2-3 months. What is the most impressive this time, in spite of all the policy and motivation incentives policy, is the speed of execution and the execution down to micro level. When we talk about micro level, is every city down to the district, down to how the corporates or people are benefiting from the policy. I mean, Andrew already mentioned the banking policy that was launched within 1 month, and then the social benefit and tax incentives also launched and executed within 1 month. That speed is extremely impressive. And then down to SOE rental rebate, it takes about 2 months, 1 or 2 months to execution, which is also very fast. And what recently just happened, like 2-3 weeks ago, it's a city level spending coupons. Hangzhou and Nanjing are launching spending coupon through WeChat and Alipay down to 10 RMB. So you spend over 40 RMB, you can use a coupon of 10. You have to register yourself and get your coupon quota. But Hangzhou alone is issuing 1.6 billion RMB of spending coupon, and subsidized by the government, and they're all in execution. They're all over the news. So I guess, apart from having the policy, is how everything executed and to the speed that is needed. The second part about the lockdown and tracking on big data, I mean, you can criticize it the way you want, but then every one of us within in China will have to have a code, and subject to which city you are and subject to you using China Mobile, your travel and everything is tracked. And when you scan a code, everything showed up, and then each city will want to ask you for a green code to enter the city or the hotels and the restaurants. That's also a very impressive one with the use of big data.
And are those measures expected to be temporary, Tammy?
It seems to us that it's executed well and people rejected the code initially, but now because you have to use it, and people are generally like amazed at how big data can help us to track us and make sure we're safe. I think it's generally well adapted now.
Oh, thank you very much. And just basically, just touching with Andrew once more, a lot of these policies, at least initially, have seemed to be aimed at keeping unemployment relatively low, or at least keeping cash in people's pockets should they have been laid off. China obviously being the first place hit. Are we seeing relatively stable levels of employment in China at this point?
I think that's perhaps more a question for Tammy, but certainly my impression, looking at the region and Asia Pacific as a whole, is that rising unemployment is certainly a risk, but it is not materializing in the same way that unfortunately it is in some overseas economies, in particular the US. The structure of employment systems is different in Asia. Some countries like Korea and Japan still have a tradition of lifetime employment. That's breaking down, but I think rising unemployment is something we are in general less concerned about in Asia than in the rest of the world.
Right, and within China, we're not seeing massive layoff or unemployment taking out, probably because we have been through this within 8 weeks and the market is quickly recovering. So people are taking a very cautious approach, doing the right thing, cutting some costs, but we're not seeing massive layoff yet.
Oh, thank you very much. I might move on now to a bit more of a discussion as to how markets have actually responded to this stimulus. And in particular, how are occupiers and investors responding to the effects of COVID-19? What are sort of the recommendations thus far? Maybe if we start with Sam on this one and then move into Terrence, if you guys could share your insights.
Yep, absolutely perfect. So I mean, to start with the first one, how the market's reacted to stimulus packages. I think from an occupier perspective, there haven't been any direct stimulus packages that I've seen, not from a sort of an occupier perspective across the board. Maybe Singapore has seen some form of stimulus, and we will see some sort of a rent abatement, equivalent maybe of 25% to 30% of 1 month's rent that will be passed down from landlords to tenants over the immediate future. But other than that, the stimuluses tend to have been around sort of more the retail element and definitely some around the SMEs. So more to be seen, I think, as we get a better understanding of how those stimuluses are being utilized and how they're also being, or how occupiers are being benefited, but I haven't got a huge amount more on that for now. What I can expand on a little bit really is just sort of how occupiers are responding and some of those recommendations. I mean, earlier I mentioned there that of the research we've done, 50% of the occupiers are looking for some sort of rental relief. And definitely what we're seeing is that, you know, most of the occupiers are taking a short to medium term approach. They've got a two-strand strategy in this part of the world. One was, the initial make sure their people were safe and sound and had somewhere to work. Obviously, as Andrew talked about, the world's greatest work from home experiment. But that was the first. And I think once that was settled, obviously cash flow became an issue. And, most of our clients have come back to us. Most of the occupier clients have come back around sort of profitability in terms of managing through to the end of 2020, in terms of the short term, but also making sure that, they built sustainability into their businesses for 2021 and onwards. like we've all said here, there has been no precedent. So a lot of this is unique. We've talked about a number of these strategies over the years, but it's the first time that we perhaps had an economic and a pandemic hitting at the same time. So a lot of this is us making recommendations and clients coming to us with a lot of questions. But I think if we looked at the short term, Sean, which is probably the most relevant to this group, it's very, very simplistic in that, most of this has started with, understanding the leases. Force majeure has been talked about. We haven't seen much in the way of force majeure being implemented in this part of the world, but we have been recommending customers and clients that they should be talking to their lawyers. And then it comes down to business continuity, making sure that people have got a place to occupy space from. And then it really was, in this part of the world, to acknowledge that both the landlord and the tenant are suffering here. This is not just an occupier perspective, it's both sides of the marketplace. And to really recognize and understand that the relationship between the two parties is absolutely key. And at all times, make sure that communication is open and is documented, and full transparency. So from an occupier perspective, if the desire is to renegotiate a lease, look for a rent-free period, a rent abatement, is to really explain to the landlord why it's necessary, and to look at that long-term relationship. And it goes without saying to negotiate, not litigate. We had a couple of examples at the outset where people were really looking to go in there and say, look, we're not paying rents unless you give us this. Our recommendation has always been, there's two sides to this and we need to work together. But that then has, I guess, provided occupiers with opportunities in terms of creative leases. We've talked about blend and extend. A number of the markets here, the rents have been rising, so there is an opportunity to lock in at a slightly lower rent for a longer period of time. And landlords have definitely been flexible to that, where an occupier's got a longer term opportunity. Rent freeze have been beginning to be offered on an ad hoc basis. It's definitely not a common trend at the moment, and we are looking at early renewals as well. I think some of the things we've been recommending the occupiers are, look at short-term renewals for the moment. If you've got a renewal come up, make it short-term so that you can get a better understanding of your portfolio. How do you use your space? Social distancing has become a big issue in terms of how the space is occupied. We've talked agile working over the last couple of years, but really not necessarily saving space, but refitting space to give people more square foot per person is something. And I think definitely where possible, and landlords have been open to this as well, is to hold over for a couple of months. Well, perhaps you get to, I think, the more medium-term recommendation, which is to really do a holistic portfolio analysis, which is to sort of look at your portfolio, benchmark it, really look for some cost savings there to take advantage of the markets that will, bit by bit, I think, become more tenant-focused. Hong Kong is becoming more tenant-focused. Shanghai, Beijing will become more tenant-focused. Singapore will. The outlier, perhaps, in this part of the world will be Tokyo, but there's definitely opportunities for tenants and occupiers within the immediate to medium-term future. And I think if you can analyze your portfolio, the recommendation is to look at rationalizing and optimizing. And then, to answer the first part of this question, if there are some government incentives, to take advantage of those as we get a little bit more clarity around what they mean from an occupier perspective.
Sorry, before we get to Terence, Sam, one of the most striking things I think you said was at the beginning, where you said this is affecting both landlords and tenants. For the benefit of everyone on the call, could you maybe elaborate on how each are feeling the effects of this?
I mean, the tenants are obviously feeling from an immediate cash flow perspective in terms of business continuity. For the first time ever, pretty well, outside of China, most of the offices are locked down, and so the ability for certain sectors in particular, from an occupational perspective, to make money day to day is just not there. The businesses have just dried up, and there's a lot of wait and see across Asia Pacific at the moment. From a landlord perspective, and again, depends which market it is, but a lot of the landlords are heavily leveraged. They've got mortgages of their own, they've got bank loans of their own. This isn't just a matter of someone turning around saying, I can't pay you rent. They in turn have to be paying banks or their own stakeholders, shareholders as well. So I think it is important to understand that, in most of the markets, both parties are businesses and going concerns and need money to keep on functioning on a month-to-month basis. And that's why I say it's important that they sort of are totally open and transparent in their communication so they can understand exactly what each other's positions are. We've been talking a lot to our valuations department here in Asia to understand exactly what it is from a landlord's perspective in terms of what the pain points are, so we can avoid those when advising our occupier clients around strategies to help them in the short term.
Thank you very much. That's very good advice to be heeded. And Terence, are you seeing, can you describe what you're seeing from an investment market?
Sure, Sean. Now, from the investor's perspective, what they are always most concerned with is the economic growth of the markets, right? So far, what they saw, the stimulus package that were introduced are mainly to protect jobs and livelihood and to maintain a reasonable employment level rather than to stimulate growth. Of course, we are seeing, like what Tammy is saying, China just starting to introduce measures or economic stimulants to promote growth, like issuing the coupons in Nanjing. So only China is starting to do that, but the other markets is still trying to maintain employment for its people. So it's a bit too early for the real estate investors to react. Most of them are still trying to understand and understand the impact that this crisis is having on the economically as well as on the financial side. But what we are seeing is credit is shrinking. A lot of the financial institutions have stopped lending. That is disturbing, and some owners, property owners, have started to deleverage. I think one of the markets in Hong Kong is the fastest market to respond with with a drop in asking prices. It's the only market we saw that some of the investment properties have dropped their price by up to 30% of the previous valuation. So we also will see that this market, being traditionally a very responsive market, to come back very quickly as well. I think if from an investor's perspective, of course, is a window where they can look at securing assets that they normally would not have the opportunity to do so. But the back of their mind, they will be concerned how bad this global recession will be. Where's the bottom? So what we do recommend is continue to keep a close pulse on the markets, understand what are the available opportunities, what are the motivation of some of the sellers, and what are some of the long-term fundamentals of some of the opportunities that they come across. But it's very important to be able to identify which market will be the first to recover, which sector will give you the strong longer-term economic fundamentals. We are beginning to see some distinction between different asset class in terms of risk-return profile. We'll talk more about it at a later stage, but it's interesting to see that this scenario, this event actually start to showcase that different asset class do behave and react differently in this crisis. That's all from me.
Thank you, Terence. And I mean, I guess sticking with this sort of theme of the sectors of the market, I'm wondering which sectors do you think stand to actually gain from this disruption, and which you feel will be the harder hit? If we could maybe start with Tammy.
Right. I guess it's pretty obvious to us that data centers and logistic warehousing, the biggest and strongest sector, followed by public hospitals and clinics in China. I think data center and logistic has always have a good story based on spending power and the lack of infrastructure, supply-demand dynamics. But what is been proven lately even stronger is whatever supply and infrastructure we have right now does not support the actual usage and the growth, and in particular in the urgent situation. So for example, logistic is really based on e-commerce, and then we have new customers. People are buying more online now, although they also are hit by short-term roadblocks and lack of workers. Long, medium-term, people and even local government are changing their mind on the infrastructure on logistic being infrastructure, and they need it to sustain a city to go further. Data centers is another obvious one. China just launched 7 major infrastructure sectors that they need to grow. Data center is one of 7, and for the first time brought up to a national level infrastructure because of the use of data, all the online protocols and softwares. So our logistic and data center teams are extremely busy. There are a lot of inquiries from the investment side, from the operating sides. These are real good sectors to look at right now.
Now, Tammy, given some of the disruptions that we've seen from for supply chains during this pandemic, do you think the sort of medium to long-term outlook has been changed for the logistics sector, whether it's for better, worse, or just different?
Right. So logistic players, occupiers, and e-commerce, they are quickly adapting to the changes. I think previously they run on like a catching up with the market model, but now they're able, or they're forced to take a more longer term view in terms of where their warehouse and supply chain should be located. How do we service all the demands down to the village level where a lot of spending powers are? Obviously, this is not just day one of, this has only happened because of the crisis. It has been changing, but I think the virus situation speeded up to the extent that they have to react really, really fast. And also the disturbance on the human, the HR side, human resources side, quicker adoption of technology, it's definitely coming. So I would say the supply chain disturbance is a short-term one, but what it forces is logistic player to react really fast and to plan quicker changes for the future.
Thank you very much. Sam, maybe you could share some insights from the occupier sectors.
Yep, definitely. So, I mean, the occupier piece, I mean, there's, we've all seen, I think, a number of sectors that are obviously struggling. The retail, non-food piece, aviation, global shipping. But the one I really want to focus on today is the co-working, because that sort of sits in both camps. And I think it's a relatively interesting subject matter because, up to about 6 months ago, co-working was the future. We were talking sort of 30% of every CBD was going to be part of co-working. I don't need to go through the history of what's happened recently, even pre-COVID-19, but that sector has obviously not been without its challenges. But I think co-working now becomes quite interesting because in the short term as a sector, it's really suffered. I looked up at one of the bits of analysis the other day that said that co-working is right up there with aviation and retail as one of the sectors that's really, really been suffering. And the main reason it's been suffering is because of the social distancing aspect, in terms of people are not willing to put people into a co-working center whereby you're cheek to jowl with other people of which you have absolutely no control, you have no view, no visibility of where they've been. And then you don't know whether they adhere to the same policies that you do as a human being and as a company. But it's interesting because I see that as a short term, and talking a lot to the co-working companies and the Colliers teams here, the view is that on a medium to long term basis, particularly given that there's going to be a continuing scarcity of capital, I think from an occupier perspective, definitely in the next sort of 6 to 12 months, that actually the co-working companies could play a major part in the growth around the occupier sector. Their ability to offer flexible leases, particularly in terms of uncertainty, is particularly as we come out of COVID-19 and no one really understands exactly what the trigger points for coming out are going to be. But that flexibility without having to really adhere to a longer term lease, I think is going to be really beneficial. I think it's also going to change a little bit the occupiers occupy space. What we've been calling flex and core. That core element being that that is my my core piece of business. That's what I focus on day to day, and I know that that's how many people I'm going to have. But then I want to be able to ramp up, and I want to bring down the number of people I have, and I want that flexibility and the ability to build that into the portfolio, which allows people to make timely decisions, which obviously help navigate and manage cost. I think the other piece around the co-working piece is, we'll come on to it in a minute, but the working from home. I mean, still, I think in an Asia perspective, there's still a lot of people that aren't necessarily able, from an infrastructure technology perspective, just from a personnel in terms of the way that they live with families, aren't necessarily able to work from home for a significant amount of time, and they will also need other places to be. I also think you're going to find hub and spoke, as people have, or employees have, different views on the world in terms of how they occupy space. You know, they don't want to travel hours every day to get to their offices. So I think you're going to find occupiers will obviously have a major building, and then they'll have a spoke, which might well be the co-working occupiers in some of the second and third tier markets. Again, that is very much a cost-saving initiative as well as an employee welfare initiative. I then also think what the co-working is able to do is really bring amenities. We've seen amenities becoming increasingly important in Asia around the wellness and the employee experience, and this is really quite an important part. And I think the co-working companies have been partnering with a lot of landlords in this part of the world to provide those amenities, and I think this is something that is going to continue in terms of how the co-working companies expand or continue to expand. And then I think the final one, which really is going to come out of COVID-19, is wellness. You know, Australia has been a massive proponent of wellness in this part of the world for years, and Asia hasn't perhaps been as focused on wellness, but I really feel that the future of the workspace, along with the amenities and more flexibility, is going to be providing amenities and support to the individuals that help look after their own personal welfare and their own personal sort of experience around occupying space.
Oh, thank you, Sam. And we will definitely.
Sean, maybe I can add from the investor's perspective. I think with this business continuity planning issues that a lot of the markets facing, I think suburban offices, but suburban business part is also will become an important sector that investors will look seriously at. I think potentially there will be growth in demand for this sort of investment sector as well. During the SARS time, like in some of the markets, they actually promote this, but you know, a couple of years after SARS, everyone forget about this, including it happens in Singapore too. But now with what's happening, I think people are now believing in the importance to have, you know, satellite offices for PCP purposes.
That's an interesting take, Terence. And I noticed you mentioned earlier for the previous question that one of the things that investors need to watch for is what segments of the market and what geographies are going to bounce back first. Do you have any insights as to where you think, what you think some of the early movers will be, or maybe some of what you've seen already?
Yeah, right. I think investors always go to a market where they can see potential of good government, good growth of the market, where capital will be growing to. So I think so it's important for some of this government to be able to react and manage this crisis. I think I like what Tammy is saying about what the Chinese government have done. You know, it actually gives some investors the confidence about going back into the market. So we saw Hong Kong Land acquiring one of the largest site they ever happened. Is about $4 billion site in Shanghai. It's sort of so the important thing is that this time around, the government must be able to instill confidence as they react to handling how they manage this crisis, to give investors the confidence in the longer term. So market like Singapore as well is attracting a lot of attention. So at the end of this crisis, you know, you will find capital and more investment going into these better managed economies.
Thank you. And talking about some of the other economies, because I'm mindful that we have quite a few questions from participants, and there seem to be several that are focused on views on India. I'm wondering, Terence, if India is one of those markets where you've seen a little bit more demand, and maybe Andrew, if you could just run over your views of how you see India as well.
So Andrew, go ahead.
Regarding India, Sean, it's a market with enormous potential. Right now, it is clearly it is in a state of national lockdown that will surely have some effect on real estate markets over the second quarter. I don't know how long that will last, but if you look at India, some of the trends there, like continuing strong growth in IT. The IT sector is one of the major sources of demand for space in the big cities. If you look at other trends like the emergence of a logistics and industrial sector in India, which was very fragmented up to now, as long as India recovers within a reasonable length of time, those trends ought to persist. In India will have a more difficult year this year than in the recent past, but it ought to bounce back.
Yeah, Andrew, from an occupier perspective, I would agree. I think, from a net absorption, Q1 was positive. I think, Bangalore and Hyderabad are still driving a lot of the growth in India. So I think, the fact that India wasn't impacted with COVID-19 until perhaps the end of Q1 has meant that it started the year relatively well, and I think it was positivity. I think the question becomes in India, because it went into full lockdown, understandably so, because it's taken very much the Chinese approach, which is to shut it down straight away, to get over the initial hurdle, and then to start opening up the country bit by bit towards hopefully the end of April, beginning of May. I think if that is the case, from what I'm seeing around occupiers, there's still a huge amount of demand from the occupiers. A lot of that is still driven by, as you say, the IT businesses. Literally 2 weeks ago, 2 big European companies concluded over 1 million square foot of transactions in Bangalore itself. So, there is activity. From my mind, this is literally put it on hold for 1 or 2 months. I think that the second half, and probably Q4 in particular in India, will see a bounce back from an occupier perspective, and I do see that demand is still there. And as we speak to clients, it's one of the markets that they see significant growth, both in the short and medium term.
Thank you very much, Dylan. I am mindful that we only have about 12 minutes left on the scheduled webinar, and there are still a few questions to be had. So I think I might have to move it along now. And sticking with Sam, you talked about working from home earlier, and this has quickly become the new normal for billions, not only across APAC but really globally. But especially in a place like Asia, where this sort of flexible working wasn't necessarily as ingrained as in other geographies. You've mentioned Australia before. How will this sort of affect the workplace moving forward?
Thanks, Sean. I think that is it's the billion-dollar question, to use the wording already in your question. This, I think, is probably one of the more intriguing pieces of what's going to come out of COVID-19. Andrew mentioned earlier, the world's greatest work from home experiment. I think that's how the Chinese referred to the working from home pretty well for the first time. And Tammy, correct me if I'm wrong, but something in the region of 81% of all Chinese office occupiers were working at home at some stage between the end of January and the beginning of February, which is a significant number of people. I don't have the actual number, but that's a significant number. And what I would say is that is then, sorry? That is then continued. That is then continued into the rest of Asia. And there's no doubt that I think if we'd all sat here 6 to 12 months ago, we would have said that's not possible. If we'd been asked to do this under our own fruition, we'd have said working from home is not possible on that scale. But I think the fact that we've all been forced into it has shown to us that the habit is beginning to form. And what I would say on the positive side, generally speaking, particularly in places like China, Hong Kong, Singapore, the infrastructure has stood up. The cloud technology that has been implemented over the last few years really has been shown to be fully functioning. We're using technology today like webinar, but we've been running a lot of interactive meetings around Zoom. We've been collaborating on Slack, things like Microsoft Teams as well. And whilst obviously that's not necessarily as good as seeing people face to face in the office, it really hasn't caused too much of a disruption to business, definitely in the short term. What I would say, though, is it's probably a little bit too early to say exactly how this is going to play out. I've heard more positives than negatives. I think, yeah, from a manager perspective, that was always one of the concerns, particularly in this part of the world culturally. People wanted to see their employees sitting at desks next to them to confirm that they were actually doing their work for the day. I think that's changed the mindset somewhat to more of a production-based achieving results, sort of KPI results. And I think that has shown that, yeah, there is a greater level of trust. And so one of the bigger challenges has definitely been allayed. Would I say that totally managers understand that having people working remotely is in their comfort zone? Probably not, but they're definitely moving to that way. So I think overall it's definitely been positive, and I think we're definitely going to see more of it. That's not to say there haven't been some challenges. You know, I think talking to Tammy about this last week, one of the challenges in China is just the social aspect of the workplace. People like to get together, they like to have lunch together, they like to have coffee breaks together. You know, a lot of their life does revolve around interaction with their colleagues, and that is very important. Yeah, and you're going to be missing that whatever you do in terms of Zoom. I also think in terms of the day-to-day interaction, the DNA of companies, that siloed effect, I think it is fine for certain industries, but others, I think it's still going to be very important that at least some stage during the week, people are seen to get together as a team and collaborating and communicating. The other area that I think is unknown at the moment is going to be around security. This came up on a call last week. Particularly in places like Australia, this is something that has come to the fore. Yeah, with all the new types of technology, people also using their own technology solutions where there weren't necessarily laptops from work, but they were using their own systems at home on their company cloud technology. There was a potential for security risk as well, and I've seen that that's become a bit of a problem in some of the financial services, and it's going to be something that is going to be need to be addressed pretty quickly. But to answer the other piece, what does this tell us about the future? I think working from home is here to stay. I think the bubble has been burst. That's not to say it's going to stay in every market. I don't think necessarily in places like India, some of Southeast Asia, necessarily the technology and the infrastructure is necessarily there at the moment. But I do think that flexible workspace opportunities I talked to earlier is going to be something that occupiers will have to build into their portfolios that doesn't involve their people sitting at a desk of 1.8 meters with a partition into the future. I don't think that's going to be able to attract and retain the top talent. I think you're going to see smaller footprints, definitely, depending on what happens with social distancing and how comfortable people are to be coming back to the office space and how comfortable they are sitting next to each other. But then you're going to see some more decentralized locations to take advantage of cost savings. And I think a lot of this is going to be down to the uncertainty in the future environment, working environment around, yeah, can I control and minimize my real estate costs? But I think ultimately, and this is going to be where the research will end up on, has it improved productivity? Because I think if this doesn't improve productivity and people working from home are not productive, this is something that will not necessarily unravel, but will start evolving in a different manner. And I think that's what we're going to find out over the next sort of 3 to 6 months. Yeah, what does the productivity metric look like? And has the working from home enhanced it? Or is it just a mixture of having work from home and a formal office environment of some kind?
It is the billion-dollar question. And heading into the tail end of this this webinar, perhaps we could close with a bit of a longer-term view. So, in your opinions, what will a full economic recovery look like? Will this look like a reversion to some of the pre-COVID norms? Or will this be, are we looking at a reinvented global economy? I'm sensitive to the time, so perhaps if we could just keep each answer to a couple of minutes each. Andrew, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Will it lead to a reinvented global economy? I'm not sure I can answer that. But what will it mean for economies in Asia? Yes, right now Asia is going through a major challenge. But if you look at almost any predictions for what will be the center of gravity in the world in, say, the 2030s, Asia dominates it. Chinese cities, Indian cities will be or the Chinese cities will be some of the most dominant economically. Indian cities and some other cities and emerging markets like Indonesia and the Philippines will be up there as some of the world's largest population centers. Does COVID-19 change that? I don't think it does. Assuming we do have the recovery that we expect next year, then 15 years from now, Asia will really be the part of the world that matters. What will change perhaps at a city level? Greater decentralization, more focus on the outskirts of cities, secondary cities. Terence mentioned business parks, decentralized areas. All these sort of trends predated COVID-19. They perhaps have been amplified by it. So I don't think we are expecting a massive change.
I'll add one thing to that, Andrew. I'll go even further. I would say, in the same way that China was a beneficiary coming out of the GFC, I would say coming out of this, the reinvented global economy will be much more orientated towards Asia immediately, and both China will continue its fast pace, which it's already showing, and its recovery's already happened, and then India will also be following that with, from a supply chain perspective, manufacturing perspective. I think Southeast Asia will also come to the fore as well. So I see Asia as an absolute bastion of strength that will come out of this probably as the strongest regional economies.
Thank you, gentlemen. Tammy, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts you would like to share.
Right, I would add something at a micro level to explain what Andrew meant by reinventing the economy. I mean, it is easy to talk on the macro level, but down to like working from home and working on a mobile paces, adaptation of new apps, new software, new devices. How do you actually work at home to make it effective? How do you win a contract while you're on video conferencing? There's a lot of things that are new to people. How do you actually talk in front of a camera? A lot of people are scared to do that. So, I mean, all these little things actually change the way you looked at work and the sales process. And this is something really interesting. And some of our clients are already taking huge advantage of it, whoever can think ahead of others. And likewise for Colliers, we have started this really early at the process.
Thank you very much, Tammy.
Hi, Sean.
Terence,
Just to sum it up, from the investment world, I think there's a reset pattern. Over the last 10 years, there's so much liquidity in the market that the capital has been driving yields down, risk premium down to almost zero. So this is actually resetting the investment world. Variations of risk premium has to be re-examined. People will now really try to understand the risk premium to be given for different asset classes. Yields for different asset classes will right now differentiate a lot more than what happened over the last 10 years. And as we can see during this crisis, the real core assets has been very well protected, and the most resilient asset that was very defensive during this crisis is the real core asset, meaning those commercial assets that have single tenant, long WALE, government tenancy. These are the asset class that's being well protected during this crisis, and so the definition of core will be further tightened as we go forward. So these are what I see will happen once this COVID-19 is settled down.
Thank you all very, very much. Unfortunately, we're hitting up against time constraints. I'm sure there's a number of things that we could continue to talk about. I know there's a number of audience questions that we unfortunately didn't get the chance to answer. I'll reach out to each of you who asked a question and do the best that I can. But to the panelists, thank you all very much for joining us and sharing your insights. I'd also like to take a second to thank our World Built Environment Forum corporate partners. So that's our premier partner, Colliers International, and our executive partners, Shanghai Oriental Investment Supervision Co. and Gloden. And once again, please do go to the site WBEF, the WBEF site on rics.org, where you'll be able to access a recording of this webinar later this week. And last but certainly not least, we do have a poll that will appear on the screen automatically and is not included in the slides. Please do complete this because it will help us with future webinars. And thank you all very much.